Welcome to The Faithful Steward. This is a podcast all about sharing biblical wisdom and practical insights in order to help church leaders pursue and teach financial freedom as part of Christian discipleship. We believe this is a spiritual conversation, and this is a place where the church needs to lead the way in order to move our communities forward in how we steward God's resources. I'm your host, James Lenhoff, and I am so passionate about this conversation and helping leaders have the confidence to step into it. We believe that if we help people thrive financially and grow spiritually, it changes everything. And I am so excited to join you on this journey. This podcast is brought to you by Good Sense. If you'd like more information about what we're up to, you can go to our website at goodsensemovement.org. All right, let's get started with today's conversation. All right, so quick recap of where we've been and where we're going to go today. We've been walking through the 6 weeks of our content that we teach through our Freed Up app. We talk about being a faithful steward. That was week 1. And then we stepped into the fact that a faithful steward is a diligent earner and a prudent spender. And then we've been breaking down that prudent spending, starting with the fact that a prudent spender is a generous giver first, and a wise saver, and a cautious debtor. And so today we're going to talk about being a wise saver. What does it look like to be wise in our saving? You know, when we think about saving, a lot of times in the Christian context, we tend to think that saving is something that we shouldn't really over-focus on, that we don't really want to end up being wealthy. There's a lot of times a guilt or a sense of shame around accumulating and having wealth, that somehow we did it wrong, or that by default, that means that we're being greedy. And part of the reason why I think that happens is because when we accumulate a lot of wealth, sometimes we get to a place where we define our identity by our wealth. We get our security from our wealth. We get our status and our sense of significance from our wealth. And so it's not surprising that that actually is something we fear. It's not something that we want to end up tripping into. And so there's this push-pull problem that we end up with a lot of times in the Christian context. One is the push of the world saying, you should have as much as you can get. We all are scrapping and fighting for limited resources. We should all hoard and protect ourselves and accumulate as much as we possibly can. And you should live life to the fullest. You should have all of the stuff and the experiences and all the extravagance that wealth can bring. And on the other side, you have the pull, which is the church a lot of times saying, oh, don't get there. Don't go too far into that space. Don't end up being a greedy, wealthy person. We have teachings that are difficult from Jesus, like the idea that it is harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than it is for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. And so we are afraid a lot of times of becoming that rich person. And I think that's right. I think we should be really cautious about that, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't save. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be intentional about our saving. A wise saver preserves some of the resources that God has asked them to manage in order to be prepared for future obedience. We want to be in a place where we think of our savings as the empowerment, the ability for us to step into obedience in the future. One of the problems that comes with not saving is that we tell ourselves we can't give generously, we can't obey in releasing some of these resources for the kingdom because we need it. We've undersaved, we're underprepared, we need to hoard and protect as much as we can, where if we've saved in a way that is wise, then we feel more confident, we feel more comfortable, we feel steady and consistent in our approach to our money. And so if God says, hey, take some of these resources that are mine anyway and give them to that thing or use them for that purpose, we can obey. And so I like to think of saving as preparing ourselves for future obedience. One of the most important aspects of that, though, is that all of those resources that we've saved are still the master's. They're still God's resources. They're not ours. And so even though we may have earmarked them for the future, we may have set them aside, they are still his and are subject to whatever he asks us to do with them. The tipping point for me in wise saving is when we move into a place where we're finding our security, our identity, or our significance in the money that we've saved and the wealth that we've accumulated. That is when we have started to move into a selfish saver, a saver that is really most motivated by their own desires, their own pleasure, their own security, their own safety. That is the tension that we need to avoid. And so when we think of what Jesus taught about this, one of the parables that immediately comes to mind a lot of times is when he talks about the man who built bigger barns, bigger storehouses. We use that conversation a lot when we talk about stewardship in the church, that people shouldn't be building bigger barns, which a lot of times we translate into they shouldn't be building bigger houses, they shouldn't be driving nicer cars. The bigger issue in that story that Jesus is really trying to drive home for us is it's not that the person had barns. He had storehouses to begin with. It is wise to save. It is reasonable to put aside some of these resources and be prepared for the future. That makes sense. We don't need to be ashamed of it. We don't need to be afraid of it. The problem is, in Jesus' story, that this man decided at some point, because of the abundance that he was experiencing, that he would keep all of that for himself and build bigger barns, bigger storehouses, so that he could tell himself, soul, you have ample goods stored up. You are set. You don't need to worry about anything. You find your security in your wealth, and now you can eat, drink, and be merry. Now you can focus on just self-gratification and pleasure and leisure, and you don't have to work at all anymore. You don't have to think about it anymore. You can just sit on your laurels and enjoy all of the wealth that you've accumulated and that you're entitled to. That is the turn. That's where we actually leave behind the status of wise saver, and we step into the status of selfish saver. When we get to a place where the money that we have tells us we can check out, we no longer need to be adding to the kingdom, multiplying for the kingdom's sake. We can just become self-indulgent. That's when we have crossed that line. And that's what Jesus is trying to tell us in that story. It is reasonable and wise to save until we've crossed the line to where it's no longer about our future obedience. It's about our future selfishness. So in that context, what's the limit? How do we think about those lines? Where do we get to that point? Well, that is really hard for us to define in a global sense. I think the goal we need to have as we're approaching this conversation with our communities is that we need to teach them to pay attention to what they're thinking about when it comes to their money, their wealth. As they're beginning to save and as they're starting to see their net worth grow, they can start to tip into that sense of, oh, I'm almost done. I'm almost to a place where I don't have to be productive anymore. I don't need to engage anymore. I can completely disengage and focus on self-indulgence and pleasure. If the goal is to get to a retirement state that involves nothing but self-indulgence, I think we're missing the point. I don't think God is calling us to just eat, drink, and be merry. I think God is always calling us to link arms with him and be part of the work he's doing for his kingdom. And so when we get to a place where our wealth is giving us a sense of confidence and security that we can check out and focus on ourselves, and that we're entitled to do that because we've worked so hard and we saved so well, those are the stories that start to send us down the wrong path. And so it's really less about a dollar amount, because I think that's really dangerous to put some sort of cap on the wealth that God ultimately gives us to steward. The bigger issue is that no matter how big that number gets, no matter how far we move down this path of net worth accumulation, the bottom line of it is 100% of it is always God's. always. And its purpose is to be set aside for our future obedience, for our future decisions to step into the work that he's asking us to do. So it isn't about a number. It's about a mindset. It's about a sense of purpose and service. And that is what we can focus on as we think about how we save and how we want to approach saving. You have crossed that line when you no longer have a purpose for the money that you're saving. When you can't point to those resources and say, I know why I'm keeping them. I know what I'm using them for to be prepared for. And instead, I'm just throwing it on a pile that just continues to get bigger. If that's the case, then we really need to start thinking about how do we give those resources away? How do we step into more generosity beyond what we've been doing in order to really release those resources into the kingdom? It is reasonable to be prepared. It is unreasonable to hoard. So let's talk about how we're going to think about saving. This runs the spectrum from somebody who is just trying to get to where they have a little bit of breathing room, all the way to somebody who is accumulating and growing their net worth at a rate that they're not going to outspend, and they need to start thinking about generosity. Those are that's the population of your church, right? People who are barely getting by and are struggling to make ends meet and are just trying to get to where they're not dipping into debt to fix the car when it breaks. All the way up to people who have probably tipped over that line and are starting to find their identity and their status and their sense of worth in their net worth. So, at the beginning, when we're talking about that first stage, our primary focus is to get to some level of emergency fund. The way that we think about the emergency fund is we want somebody to have at least 2% of their annual income as a household set aside, ready to go. That is a minimum. That is just getting to a place where we have some flexibility to absorb the curveballs that life is going to throw at us. One of the reasons why that's so important is because we need to be able to respond to those demands without it blowing us up. We need to have enough margin in our life to be able to absorb some of those extreme, stressful moments without it sending us off a cliff into financial oblivion, right? I talk about this idea of a resting heart rate, that's really where we want to be in our finances. We want to have the ability to be steady and confident and peaceful, but we recognize, just like with our heart, sometimes we have to go climb a flight of stairs or we have to go run a lap, and our heart can respond to that demand, that stress, that temporary tension in order to meet that demand for that period, and then it returns back to resting heart rate. That's what our finances should feel like. Our saving is what allows us to do that. Our saving is what allows us to meet those short-term demands and then return back to a place of peace and steadiness. What I see often is that families are running at max heart rate all the time. They are living right up to their knife edge. Their life is absolutely pinned to their income. And if they have an extra sick day that they don't get paid for, or they have a car breakdown, or the air conditioner goes out, or they have some sort of repair that they weren't anticipating, it absolutely blows them up because they can't take it. They've been running at the absolute maximum stress level because they're right at the edge with no margin. This emergency fund savings is that minimum level of margin. What we ultimately want to get to, though, is that we would have somewhere around 90 days worth of net income. So think about 3 months worth of your paycheck, your net paycheck, not your gross, what you actually see come into your checking account. That is a level that gives you quite a bit more flexibility, quite a bit more steadiness, and it is what you're relying on to deal with the fact that months are different, that things happen seasonally. There's flexes in what is more expensive and less expensive. Things like utilities move up and down based on the season of the year that we're in. Those kinds of things need to be absorbed and recovered through that 90-day net. And when we think about that window of saving, our priority is get that emergency fund done right now, whatever it takes. Cut back, get to a place where you're living on as little as possible in order to absolutely prioritize that minimal level of margin. And then you can start to build that safety net up over time. But we don't want to build that minimal level of margin slowly, because it's going to continually be eroded by the fact that we keep having curveballs thrown at us. And so we need to really focus on getting those minimal levels in place. And that is that short-term saving, protective kind of saving that gives us the ability to not freak out, to not panic, to not react to short-term demands by stepping out of obedience. One of the things I see all the time is that people will be minimally saved in that emergency kind of context. They have very little saved. And so when something happens, the first thing they stop doing is being generous. The first thing they do is cut back on any of their giving or any of the things they're supporting or their tithe. They're stepping out of that obedience in order to protect themselves because they've been living their life too high. They've been running themselves right up to their income level. Those are things we need to make sure we avoid doing. We don't want to step out of the obedience of generosity because of a short-term stress. That's what that short-term saving buys us, continual obedience. Then when we think about saving for the long term, we're thinking about retirement savings, college funds for the kids. We think about things like weddings and future goals. Those are things that we're going to need to prioritize in the right order. There is a really high priority to getting started on your retirement savings. I hear all the time, particularly young families, say, well, once we get set up here and once we get that bought and we get this paid off, then we'll start saving. And they're missing the most powerful tool on the planet, which is compound interest. And so no matter how small it is, no matter how little we're putting in to that long-term savings, we need to start that flywheel. Because the way compound interest works is it's a parabolic curve. So the earlier you get it started, the more vertical it gets later on, the bigger it grows. And compound interest means that your money is making more money for you just by sitting there. You know, one of the hardest things about being a wise saver, and really one of the hardest things about money, is the having of it, is just letting it sit there, letting it do its thing, not immediately thinking of all the things we could do with it, not letting our brain run wild with what we could buy with what we've saved. One of the most important disciplines that a wise saver builds over time is that muscle of being able to let the money be there, to not do anything with it, to just have it, and be ready to be obedient with it, but not be constantly thinking about what it could buy you. That is such a dangerous conversation that we have with ourselves all the time. And so where we want to be in that wise saver mentality is we start retirement savings immediately, as soon as possible, start building up with as little as we can do just to get that flywheel going. If you have a 401k, we want you to get the match on that 401k. We want you to be growing those retirement assets in an efficient way. And that's one of the most powerful tools you can have. We don't want to wait. Waiting costs a lot. It means you have to save 2 or 3 or 5 times more money to end up with the same amount than it would have cost you if you'd have started earlier. So as soon as possible, we need to just get going on some of that stuff. So your priority is get your emergency savings in place, build up that 90 days worth of net, and then start down that road as soon as possible, prioritizing that retirement savings, because it is your most powerful tool to use compound interest and time to your advantage. Once we've built a net worth is just a financial term that we need to get comfortable with as a church. If you take what you own minus what you owe, that's your net worth. It's not that fancy. It's not that complicated. It's also not a statement of what you as a human are worth. It is just simply a financial measure. And the thing that's so important about net worth is that that measure gives us a really good indication of whether you're being healthy or not, whether you're being a wise saver. Your net worth over time should be going up. It goes up by you saving, and it goes up by you paying debt down. Those are both, two sides of the same coin. That net worth coin, accumulate and pay down debt, both make your net worth go up over time, right? And so when we think about people who have accumulated a lot, that have built a big net worth, now we're in that place where we need to start to think about that lifestyle cap. We talked about the lifestyle cap briefly in the spending conversation, where we're saying this is enough, this is satisfaction, this is contentment, this is what we're choosing. Built into that lifestyle cap should be, and this is our reasonable amount of saving for our retirement, for our financial priorities, for our goals, and we've built all that into our cap so that we have this clarity that when assets come in, income comes in, resources grow beyond what we said we needed, we can be really confident and really aggressive with our generosity because we know we're okay. One of the reasons why we see people over accumulating is simply because they haven't drawn those lines. They don't know what a reasonable amount to save is for retirement, and so they just save everything. They haven't drawn any of those lines and boxed that in, and so it leaves them with this situation of just accumulating because they don't have any other ideas for it, and they end up growing their net worth simply because they oversave and they don't step into generosity because they're not confident that they can. We really want to help people who are over accumulating to draw those lines, to define with a financial planner, someone that they're working with, define what is adequate, what is enough, what is a reasonable storehouse, to go back to that parable that Jesus shared with us. And then how do we avoid building bigger barns simply because we don't know what else to do with it? If we get to a place where we've drawn those lines and said, this is adequate, this will be enough, then that extra can be released into the kingdom work immediately. We're not sitting on it and just letting it accumulate for no reason. We can deploy it in the places where the master is asking us to send it. And so we need to have those conversations, not about what is the end goal, what is the end target for retirement. That is not the job of a pastor. Our job is to call people to the confidence and to the courage to step into giving that abundance away now. This is still a spiritual discussion. It is about us knowing where we've tipped into a selfish saver. We've tipped into this self-focus that's rooted in security and safety and self-protection and self-indulgence. We are in a place where we can show people the beauty of linking arms with the King of the universe to do the work his kingdom is up to. If we're willing, wise savers have adequate storehouses that are full of God's resources, and we are ready to obey the master in whatever he asks us to do with his resources that we've set aside intentionally for the purpose of obedience in the future. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Faithful Steward podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links and other information that we mentioned in today's episode. Also, be sure to check out our website at goodsensemovement.org to get all the resources we offer churches to help equip them in teaching financial stewardship to their community. If you have any questions or any topics you want to make sure we cover on our show, you can email me at jameslenhoff@goodsensemovement.org. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you all have a great week. We'll talk to you next week.